Story number 1. The Whispering Void. It began as a curious experiment, an idle pursuit in the drab, unremarkable dormitory of Miskatonic University. The 5 of us, all eager to explore the boundaries of knowledge and reality, gathered one evening around a weathered Ouija board, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. The dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere that felt almost fitting for the occult rites we intended to conduct. We had no grand expectations, at least none that we spoke aloud. The plan was simple. We would call upon the spirits, if indeed they existed, and let them speak. Perhaps the board would reveal trivial messages, words of comfort from deceased relatives or forgotten friends. The usual. At first, the plan seemed to be working as expected. The planchette moved lazily across the board, tracing vague responses to our cautious inquiries. Yes and no, occasionally a goodbye, the typical harmless things one might expect from such an ancient device. Yet, as the minutes passed, something began to shift, an unseen weight growing in the room. The air thickened, becoming stifling, suffocating even. It was Naomi, always the more skeptical of us all, who first noticed it. This is different," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hand hovered over the planchette as it began to move faster, almost violently, against the grain of the alphabet. It darted across the board in an erratic, uncontrolled manner, spelling out words none of us could comprehend. At first, we laughed nervously, chalking it up to a trick of the mind, the mere fanciful consequence of a harmless game. But then the words became clearer, sharper, as though they were not only being written but imprinted upon the very air around us. The symbols on the board, twisted and alien, began to emerge in patterns I did not recognize, and a deep unease grew within me. At that moment, something changed. It was subtle at first, a strange vibration in the floorboards, a soft hum that seemed to emanate from the board itself. But it grew louder, darker. A low, hollow murmur echoed in my mind, as though something was speaking directly into the recesses of my thoughts. I had spent months poring over forbidden texts, ancient grimoires long forgotten by the majority of mankind. I had studied the dead languages, the esoteric symbols, and the cryptic passages that no sane person would ever dare to examine. I should have known better. One of the symbols, an unfamiliar rune etched into the board, matched the descriptions I had read in the tomes. I had encountered this symbol once, in the margins of a dismal manuscript, a forgotten name that was whispered only in the darkest corners of the ancient world. The name, like the shadow it cast, was one that should never have been spoken aloud. It was then that I understood what we had done. This was no spirit we had called, no benign entity from beyond the veil. No, this was something far older, far more terrible, something that existed outside the bounds of time, lurking in the void between the stars and beneath the fabric of reality itself. As the planchette continued its frantic movements, I could no longer focus on the written symbols. My mind unraveled, distorted by glimpses of the entity, an immense, formless presence that had no shape, no true substance, but was bound inextricably to the universe's darkest crevices. I saw visions of cyclopean landscapes, vast, writhing horrors that defied all reason. I saw time itself fracture and twist into impossible shapes, where every moment seemed to stretch and bend into an eternal, mind-bending nightmare. I could feel it then, something watching us. The room itself felt alive, pulsating with a suffocating, unseen presence. The whispers grew louder, insistent, as though the void itself were trying to communicate. The others were not immune. Naomi, once so certain of her disbelief, trembled violently, clutching her head as if trying to keep it from falling apart. Kevin, who had been the most eager among us to see something supernatural, was now frozen in terror, his eyes wide and unblinking. Only Rachel, always quiet and reserved, seemed to understand what had happened, her face paling as she recognized the names spelling out across the board. The whispers had turned to screams now, incoherent but urgent. I saw them, the faces of things I could not comprehend, stretching out of the dark recesses of the room. I saw glimpses of a world that existed before ours, before the stars even, a world that should have never been seen. They were all reaching for us, trying to drag us into their realm, into the space between time where we would be lost forever. We had opened the door, and it was far too late to close it. I barely remember the moment we stopped. The last thing I recall is Naomi screaming, her voice torn apart by the sound of grinding metal and shifting earth. And then, nothing. Silence. The room returned to its normal dreary state. The Ouija board lay in the middle of the floor, still, the planchette now pointing to goodbye in a way that felt too final, too calm. But the whispers never stopped. Not in our minds, not in our sleep. We had called something from the void, and it was with us now, lingering just beyond the edge of our understanding, forever haunting us with the truth of a reality too terrible to bear. And that name, that cursed name, still echoes in the dark corners of my thoughts. We were never meant to know it. Story number 2. The Eldritch Encounter. It was the mansion that did it, this old decaying relic of a house that I had inherited from my late wife's family. She had passed away under tragic circumstances, and I was left with nothing but memories of her gentle smile and warm touch. The grief consumed me, making the emptiness of my life unbearable. In my desperate search for closure, I turned to the occult, hoping that some dark ritual could bridge the gap between life and death. I had heard the rumors, of course. Stories of people who had tried to contact the dead using Ouija boards and other means, most of them ending in failure, or worse, madness. But I did not care. I had to know. I had to reach her, even if it meant tearing apart the fabric of reality itself. It was late one evening when I decided to perform the ritual. The mansion, though vast, was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. Dust hung in the air like a fog, untouched by time. I set the Ouija board up in the parlor, the very room where we had spent so many evenings together before her untimely passing. I lit the candles, their flickering flames casting long, strange shadows on the cracked walls. I placed my hands upon the planchette and called out to her, my voice trembling. "Elizabeth, if you can hear me, please give me a sign." The planchette moved slowly, almost lazily at first, spelling out familiar messages, words of comfort, words I had heard before in dreams, like echoes of a life once lived. My heart swelled with hope as I thought that perhaps, just perhaps, I had made contact with her spirit. But then something strange happened. The planchette stopped, and for a moment everything in the room fell silent. The air grew heavy, as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath. And then, slowly, the planchette moved again. But this time, the words it spelled were not familiar. They were strange, nonsensical. A name, one that sent a shiver down my spine. Arkham. I froze. I had never heard of such a place. The name felt alien, as though it didn't belong in the world I knew. But the board wasn't finished. It continued, and the letters began to form a sentence. Beyond the abyss, it calls. I sat back, my mind racing. Arkham, the abyss. I had to know more. Driven by an unrelenting compulsion, I began to search through the mansion's dusty library, pulling down ancient books and tattered manuscripts. I found mention of Arkham in a few pages, but it wasn't the Arkham I had expected. This wasn't a town or a city. It was a place from long ago, a forgotten civilization built on the edge of an abyss that stretched far beyond the bounds of human understanding. The more I read, the more I uncovered. An ancient, cursed city that had long since been abandoned, its people vanished into time. The texts spoke of a terrible darkness that lay beneath the city, an otherworldly rift that defied all logic. They claimed that the spirits of the dead who had once inhabited Arkham still reached across time, their whispers creeping into the world of the living. And worse still, there were mentions of something else, a creature of unspeakable horror, something that lived in the depths of the abyss and longed to break free. As the days passed, my obsession with Arkham grew. I could not escape the feeling that I was being drawn toward it, that the abyss was calling me as it had once called the people of that doomed city. It wasn't just the knowledge that haunted me. It was the sense of something watching me. I would hear whispers at night, soft and unintelligible, but unmistakably real. I would turn, expecting to see my wife, but there was nothing but shadows, stretching and warping unnaturally in the flickering candlelight. And then, one night, the presence grew stronger. I woke to find the mansion thick with a suffocating blackness, as though the very walls had absorbed the night itself. The whispers were louder now, more urgent. I could feel them in my bones, crawling under my skin. They were coming from the cellar, I was certain of it. I descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The stone walls of the cellar seemed to shift and change, as though they were alive, warping in response to the unnatural forces that now flooded the mansion. At the far end of the room, I saw it. A crack in the floor, a tear in the fabric of the world itself. From within, I could hear the faint, horrifying sound of something alive. And then I saw it. A form, indescribable and vast, looming from the crack. It was not of this world, not of any world, a shape that seemed to shift and pulse with an otherworldly energy, its tendrils stretching out from the abyss, reaching for me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in its gaze, if it could even be called that. It was not eyes that looked at me, but a presence, something ancient and unspeakable. I heard my wife's voice then, soft and loving, but tinged with an unnatural chill. "Come to me, my love," she whispered. But it wasn't her voice. It was something else, something that had taken her form, pulling me closer to the edge of the abyss. In my final moments, I understood. Arkham had never been abandoned. The people had not vanished. They had been taken, drawn into the depths of the void by the creature that lived there. And now, it was my turn. The mansion is empty now. The mansion and the abyss are one. My body is gone, lost to the dark, but my spirit remains, trapped between worlds, calling out for anyone foolish enough to listen. The abyss still calls, and soon it will call again. Story number 3. The Letters of Madness. I had always prided myself on being a writer, yet for the past several months an oppressive and unshakable block had taken hold of me. The words that once flowed so easily now seemed distant, intangible. My mind, once a fountain of ideas, had dried up into a barren wasteland. No matter how many hours I sat at my desk, staring at the blank page, the creative spark refused to return. I had tried everything: long walks, reading, meditation, anything to shake the paralysis in my mind. But nothing worked. The silence in my head grew louder with each passing day. In my desperation, I turned to the occult. I had heard rumors, stories of artists and writers who had summoned their muses using unconventional methods. The most intriguing, and perhaps foolish, was the idea of using a Ouija board. It seemed absurd, but the thought of having an unseen force speak directly to me, to guide me through the fog of my creativity, was a temptation I could not resist. One evening, in a dimly lit corner of my study, I set the board down on the table. The room, cluttered with books and old manuscripts, felt suffocating. I lit a candle and placed my fingers lightly on the planchette. As I began to focus on the empty spaces between the letters, I called out, almost jokingly, "Is there anyone here? Can you help me?" At first, nothing happened. I almost laughed at myself for indulging in such nonsense. But then, the planchette moved. Slowly, deliberately, it glided across the board. "Yes," it spelled out. A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the slight shift of my fingers, a subconscious movement. I asked again, "Who are you?" The answer was quick, almost too quick for me to follow. "I am the one who speaks through the silence." I paused. The words didn't make much sense, but they didn't seem harmful. I felt a flicker of hope. This was it. My muse, the inspiration I had been so desperately searching for. Encouraged, I asked more questions, each one more focused than the last. But as the planchette moved, the answers began to grow darker, more cryptic. "Knowledge is poison to those who seek it," the board spelled out one evening, the letters trailing across the surface with an unnatural speed. I blinked, a cold feeling creeping up my spine. That wasn't what I had expected. I tried to brush it off, but the message lingered in my mind. Every night I returned to the board, and every night the answers became stranger and more fragmented. They spoke of forbidden texts, ancient wisdom, and warnings of a force beyond comprehension. Warnings that I foolishly ignored. As the weeks passed, my dreams became vivid, too vivid. They were no longer mere dreams. They felt real, as though I were living them. I would wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, only to find myself back at my desk, scribbling notes in a fevered haze. The lines between dream and reality began to blur. I could hear the whispers in the darkness, the same words I had transcribed from the board. The presence was always there, just out of sight, but I could feel it, watching, waiting. The more I used the Ouija board, the more I became consumed by it. Each time the messages became more fragmented, like a puzzle that I was desperately trying to piece together. They were no longer just cryptic warnings. They were instructions, guides to an ancient, forbidden knowledge that called to me from the darkness. In my waking hours, I wrote. The words poured out of me like a flood, faster and more furiously than I had ever written before. The text seemed to flow through me, as though it were being dictated by some unseen hand. I was no longer in control. I was merely a vessel, transcribing the visions and words that came from the abyss. It wasn't long before I realized the full extent of what I had done. The entity I had unknowingly summoned was not merely a muse, it was something far more sinister. It had taken hold of my mind, warping my perception of reality. The world around me had begun to change. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision. I would catch glimpses of shapes, hulking, unnatural shapes that did not belong to this world. They seemed to follow me, just out of sight, their presence felt but never seen. The final night came when I could no longer distinguish between the world of the living and the world of the dead. I sat at my desk, feverishly writing the last lines of the text that had consumed me. The words were no longer my own. They were the words of the entity, the one that had spoken through the board. As I finished the final sentence, I looked up and saw it, standing in the doorway of my study, a grotesque, shadowy figure, its form twisting and shifting, as though it could not exist in this dimension. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were pools of darkness, endless and deep, like the very abyss from which it had come. I felt my sanity unraveling, the last threads of my mind snapping under the weight of the forbidden knowledge I had summoned. But it was too late to turn back. I had crossed the line. The entity had claimed me, body and soul. The words I had written were its gateway, and now there would be no escape. The house is silent now. The pen is still. The pages I wrote, filled with the twisted fragments of an ancient, eldritch text, lie scattered across my desk. I can no longer distinguish between what I wrote and what the entity wrote through me. I hear its whispers, ever present in my mind, beckoning me to continue, to write until there is nothing left. And in the darkness, I know it is waiting, patiently, for the next fool to summon it. Story number 4. The Summoning. It was supposed to be a simple thrill, a dare we would laugh about later. A group of friends, restless with boredom and seeking something more than the mundane lives we led, decided to visit the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The stories about it had been whispered for years. Stories about its dark history, the madness that had consumed its patients, and the unsettling rumors of strange rituals performed within its crumbling walls. But none of us truly believed in the tales. We thought we were invincible, naive in our youthful arrogance. It was Ellie who first suggested the Ouija board. Why not? "It'll be fun," she said, her voice light and teasing. She always had a way of convincing us to do things we wouldn't normally consider. So, there we were, a group of 5 standing in the middle of a decaying asylum, candles flickering, the air thick with dust and decay, a single Ouija board between us on the floor. At first, everything seemed harmless. We sat in a circle, hands resting on the planchette, joking and laughing as the board moved, spelling out familiar answers to simple questions. It was the typical, silly responses you'd expect from a game like this. "Who's there?" someone asked, and the planchette moved lazily to spell out, "Hello." We laughed, the sound echoing through the hollow, empty building, the floorboards creaking under our weight. But then, something shifted. The planchette moved faster, more deliberately, as if guided by an unseen force. "Do you want to communicate?" Ellie asked, and the answer came quickly. "Yes." We were all on edge now, the air growing heavier with each movement of the planchette. Still, we pressed on, intrigued. And then it happened. The board began to spell out strange, disjointed words. Words that made no sense. "Forgotten," it spelled, followed by cult. We paused, staring at each other in disbelief. None of us had asked about anything like that. The messages grew more erratic, increasingly disturbing. "Sacrifice," it spelled next, followed by a name we didn't recognize. Xalthor. None of us spoke. The air was thick now, stifling, as if the building itself were closing in on us. Ellie, despite the growing sense of unease, asked another question. "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, slowly and deliberately, as though it was savoring the words it formed. "We are the ones who worship." A chill ran down my spine. It was as if the room itself held its breath, the darkness pressing in from all sides. We were no longer in control. The room felt wrong, alive with a presence we couldn't see but could certainly feel. The entity, whatever it was no longer playful. It was something else, something ancient beyond our understanding. Then the message came, one that sent the blood draining from my face. "You are part of the ritual." I felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure, like something was bearing down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. We tried to stop, to break the circle, but the planchette refused to stop moving. It was as if it had a life of its own, guiding our fate. It kept spelling out words I did not want to hear, The ritual is incomplete. Panic set in as I looked around at my friends. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with terror. The asylum seemed to come alive, the walls closing in on us, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. But it wasn't just the room that had changed. Something was happening to each of us. I saw visions, flashes of monstrous, impossible landscapes, places that twisted and writhed in ways that defied all logic. I heard screams that sounded like they came from 1,000 souls trapped in the depths of time. I could feel their suffering, their madness, flooding into my mind. And I wasn't alone in this. Ellie, who had been the most excited, was now trembling, her hands clutched tightly around the planchette. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, staring at something none of us could see. "It's watching us," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It knows we're here." The other 4 of us were trapped, unable to break free from the grasp of whatever force had taken hold of the asylum. We tried to run, but the hallways seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. The walls were pulsating, and the shadows moved as though alive, closing in on us from all sides. We were drawn deeper into the building, each step feeling like we were descending into madness. And then, one by one, we began to see it. It. The entity that had been lurking behind the veil, watching us. It was not something that could be described in any meaningful way. It was a presence, vast and incomprehensible, a thing that existed beyond the very fabric of reality. Its shape, if you could call it that, was an amalgamation of shadow and horror, an otherworldly being that thrived on suffering and chaos. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were empty, vast voids, sucking the very sanity from anyone who gazed upon them. It was coming closer, its influence spreading through the asylum, warping everything it touched. I could feel my grip on reality slipping away, the walls of the building stretching and bending, the air thick with the stench of rot and despair. The last thing I remember is the feeling of the ground shifting beneath my feet, the crushing weight of the presence bearing down on me, and the overwhelming realization that the ritual we had unwittingly begun could not be undone. We had awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed. The room fell silent, and then nothing but darkness. None of us emerged from the asylum that night. No one has dared to enter it since. The doors remain locked, and the board, still stained with the remnants of our folly, lies forgotten in the dust. But the entity still watches, and the ritual is not yet complete. Somewhere, in the shadows, it waits, knowing that the next unsuspecting souls will come, and the cycle will begin again. Story number 5. The Boundless Darkness. It all started in that quiet, forgotten town, a place where the days passed without much change, and the mundane routine of life could almost suffocate the soul. It was a town where nothing truly strange ever happened, yet a sense of unease always seemed to hang in the air like a fog that never lifted. I, Thomas Graves, had grown up in this place, and it was here that I would encounter something that would forever change the course of my life. One afternoon, while sorting through the contents of an old estate sale, I came across an object that piqued my curiosity, an ancient Ouija board. The board had been tucked away in a box, hidden beneath yellowing papers and dust. At first glance, it seemed nothing more than a relic of a past age, worn and faded, its edges chipped and brittle with age. But there was something about it, something that called to me in ways I couldn't explain. Its surface bore strange, unfamiliar symbols that I could not recognize, and it felt as though the board itself held a weight far greater than its physical form. The elderly woman running the sale mentioned that the board had belonged to a notorious occultist, a man whose name had been whispered about in hushed tones by the older generations in town. His reputation was one of madness, and the stories surrounding him were unsettling, filled with cryptic warnings and strange occurrences. Yet none of that deterred me. In fact, I found myself drawn to it, as though some unseen force were guiding me to take it. When I returned to my small apartment, the board sat on my desk, beckoning me. I had heard of Ouija boards before, heard the rumors, heard the warnings, but I had never truly believed in them. Still, the curiosity gnawed at me, and as night fell and the silence of my apartment settled around me, I felt an overwhelming need to try it. I placed my hands on the planchette, my fingers cold against the worn wood, and whispered into the stillness, "Is anyone here?" The planchette moved, slowly at first, then more deliberately, as though responding to my call. It spelled out a single word, "Yes." I froze. My heart raced, but the air around me remained still, heavy. I asked again, almost out of instinct, "Who are you?" The planchette glided across the board, faster now, as though it had a will of its own, spelling out something I could not immediately understand. The letters formed a name unlike anything I had ever heard before. Zalthor. I recoiled, a chill running down my spine. It sounded like no earthly name, no language I could recognize. Yet something about it felt familiar, almost as if it was a name I should have known. With trembling hands, I continued, "What do you want?" The planchette moved again, this time with unnerving speed. The words it spelled out seemed to come from somewhere far beyond me, from a place that was not of this world. "Come, see, the boundless darkness." I felt a cold weight in my chest, as though the room had suddenly grown colder. I paused, my breath shallow, but something within me urged me to continue. Perhaps it was the overwhelming curiosity, or perhaps it was the strange allure of whatever was speaking through the board. The next few days were a blur. I found myself returning to the board, night after night. Each time, the messages became more cryptic, more unsettling. The entity, which I now began to think of as Zalthor, began to offer me glimpses, visions, of vast, incomprehensible landscapes, stretching far beyond the stars. I saw planets that defied all logic, swirling vortices of color that seemed to shift and writhe in ways that no earthly physics could explain. I saw cities that floated in the vacuum of space, made of materials that seemed both familiar and alien, inhabited by beings whose forms I could not fathom. Their eyes, if they could even be called eyes, stared back at me from the depths of the visions, watching, waiting. The more I used the board, the more obsessed I became. The boundaries between my reality and the visions blurred. I would wake in the dead of night, my mind swimming with images of alien worlds, my thoughts consumed by the vastness of the void. The room around me seemed to distort when I wasn't paying attention. I would see shadows moving where there were none, feel the walls closing in as though the very fabric of the universe was warping around me. I could feel myself slipping away, losing something with each communication, with each question asked. It was as if the more I learned, the more I opened myself to this entity, the more I lost of myself, my sense of self, my sanity. Zalthor would offer me knowledge, but with each piece of forbidden truth came a price, a cost I could no longer fully comprehend. I would hear voices in the dark, whispers that seemed to come from the very corners of my mind. I would see flashes of the landscapes Zalthor had shown me, their vastness overwhelming. The stars stretched and twisted, and I felt myself drawn to them, pulled into the darkness. The very laws of reality, which I had once relied on, now seemed fluid, bending under the weight of something far older, far more powerful than anything I could understand. And yet, I could not stop. I could not tear myself away from the board. I had to know more. I had to see the boundaries of the darkness, to understand the vastness of the cosmos, even if it meant losing everything. One night, I asked the board a final question, my voice trembling with anticipation and fear. What happens when I see everything? The planchette moved slowly, almost lazily, spelling out a single, final answer. You will be the darkness. I felt a cold rush wash over me, as if the very essence of the universe was unraveling around me. The room seemed to disappear, and the void, the boundless darkness, began to swallow me whole. I was no longer in my apartment. I was no longer in this world. I was somewhere else, somewhere beyond time and space, where the laws of reality no longer applied. The last thing I saw, before everything faded into nothingness, was the face of Zalthor, its gaze filled with a terrible, ancient knowing. And then there was nothing. The darkness claimed me, as it had claimed so many before me. Story number 6. The Forgotten Path. The grief of losing my brother James had consumed me. He had been everything to me, my confidant, my closest friend. The suddenness of his death, the accident that took him from this world far too soon, left me hollow. The world seemed dimmer without him, and I couldn't escape the crushing weight of loss. I tried everything to numb the pain, work, distractions, even trying to forget. But nothing worked. It was as though a part of me had been ripped away, and I couldn't find peace. I was lost. It was on one particularly sleepless night that I came across the Ouija board. I had heard stories of people using it to contact the dead, to communicate with lost loved ones. I had always been skeptical, dismissive even. But that night, desperate for anything that might give me a sense of closure, I pulled it from an old chest in my attic and set it up in the dim light of my living room. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the house settling around me. "James," I whispered, my voice trembling. "If you can hear me, please give me a sign." The planchette, which had remained still for so long, slowly began to move. At first, it seemed harmless, even comforting. It spelled out a simple message. "Hello." I gasped, my heart racing. It could have been a trick, my own hand shifting the planchette. But no, there was something there, something pulling it toward the letters. I asked again, my hands steadying over the board, "Is this really you, James?" The answer came, quick and direct. "Yes." Relief flooded through me. I felt a strange sense of peace, like a weight had lifted off my chest. For the first time since his death, I felt that perhaps I could finally talk to him, hear his voice again. But soon, the messages grew stranger, the words more erratic, as if they no longer came from my brother. "Where is the path?" the planchette spelled. I paused, the question hanging in the air like a puzzle I couldn't solve. What did it mean? The tone was different now, less like James and more like an echo of something older, something colder. The words didn't feel right. I tried to push it away, to dismiss it as my imagination running wild, but something inside me urged me to continue. "James, please," I asked. "What do you mean?" The planchette moved again, but this time it didn't just spell out words. It started to write symbols, strange, twisting marks that I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, alien, like nothing I had ever seen. The symbols were incomprehensible, their meaning lost to me. I tried to make sense of them, but my head began to ache, a sharp pain throbbing in my temples. "Where is the truth?" it spelled out next, and then a series of chaotic symbols flooded the board, faster than I could follow. It was as if something was taking over, something that wasn't my brother at all. I stared at the board in horror as the planchette slid across the surface, carving out more messages. I am here. He is with me. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. My brother, James, wasn't speaking to me. He wasn't trying to reach out. It wasn't his voice I was hearing, but something else, something far older. A presence that had taken hold of him, that had reached through the veil between life and death and taken his place. As the days passed, the communication with the board continued, each session more disturbing than the last. The voice that came through was not my brother's. It was deep, hollow, and unnatural. It spoke of things I couldn't understand, dark things, things that made my skin crawl. It spoke of forgotten paths, of places beyond the mortal world, of entities that existed between dimensions. Each time I reached out, the messages grew more twisted, more incomprehensible. The symbols on the board changed, becoming more intricate and sinister, as if the very fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. And with each communication, I could feel myself slipping, losing grip on what was real. My thoughts began to warp, as if they weren't entirely my own anymore. I could hear whispers in my mind, cold and disembodied, urging me to follow the path that had been shown to me. I began to question everything. The house felt different now. It was as if it had become a prison, the walls closing in around me, the air thick with an unseen presence. At night, I would hear scratching sounds coming from the walls, as though something was trying to get in. I saw fleeting glimpses of shadows, shapes that didn't belong, moving in the corners of my vision. I could feel the weight of those ancient eyes watching me, always just out of reach. But it wasn't just the house that was changing. It was me. I could feel it, like a creeping fog, filling my thoughts, clouding my mind. I had never been more certain of anything in my life. My brother had not truly died. He had become something else. He had become a vessel for the thing that now spoke through him. And it was growing stronger with each passing day, its presence spreading like a disease, consuming everything in its path. I had to stop, but I couldn't. Each time I touched the board, I felt myself being pulled deeper, deeper into whatever dark abyss my brother had become part of. The path, the forgotten path, was waiting for me, a road I couldn't help but follow, even though I knew it would lead to madness. It was too late now. The entity had already taken hold. It was only a matter of time before it consumed me completely, just as it had consumed James. The truth was undeniable. The path had been forgotten, but I had found it, and now I could never turn back. Story number 7. The Language of the Stars. For as long as I can remember, the night sky has always called to me. As a child, I would lie on the grass and stare at the stars, imagining all the worlds out there waiting to be discovered. My fascination with the heavens grew as I did, and by the time I was an adult, I became an astronomer, dedicating my life to studying the vast expanse of space. Yet, despite the countless stars and galaxies I observed, one question gnawed at me relentlessly. Are we alone in the universe? The search for extraterrestrial life had always been my driving force. I scoured the skies with my telescope, looking for any sign, any anomaly that might point to something beyond Earth. But after years of fruitless searching, I was beginning to lose hope. The answers I sought seemed just out of reach, like a distant star that never quite came into focus. It was then, in my darkest moment of frustration, that I came across the Ouija board. I had heard rumors, of course, stories about people using it to contact the dead, to reach beyond the grave. But my mind, trained in logic and science, dismissed it as nothing more than superstition and chance. That is, until I stumbled upon an old, dusty Ouija board in a forgotten corner of an antique shop. The wooden board was weathered and chipped, its surface covered in strange symbols I had never seen before. It called to me, and I bought it on impulse. I didn't know what I expected to happen that night. I suppose I thought it might be a bit of fun, a way to clear my mind and shake off the weight of my obsession. But the moment I placed my fingers on the planchette and asked, "Is there anyone out there?" I felt a strange sensation, a pressure in the air, an unseen force pushing down on me. The planchette began to move. At first, the answers were vague, cryptic. "YES," it spelled out. "Where?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The planchette moved again, spelling out, "Beyond." I chuckled to myself, dismissing it as some strange coincidence. But I asked more questions, each one more specific than the last. "Are you from another planet?" I asked, half expecting the board to simply move to "No." Instead, the planchette slid across the board, spelling out something that made my heart race. "Stars." The symbols on the board began to change, becoming more intricate and angular, unlike anything I had ever seen. The shapes twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, forming patterns I could barely comprehend. It was as though the board itself was trying to communicate in a language that was not human. Each time the planchette moved, it felt as though I was pulling at threads that connected me to something vast, something ancient. Then the symbols grew clearer. I saw star maps, strange, alien constellations that did not belong to any known pattern in the sky. The shapes of the stars, the lines connecting them, were unlike anything I had ever studied. It was as if I were seeing the universe through the eyes of beings who saw time and space in a completely different way. The more I studied the maps, the more I saw vast worlds, swirling nebulas, and dark, empty spaces that seemed to stretch on forever. As I deciphered the messages, I began to see glimpses of these worlds that were so alien, so beyond my understanding, that my mind struggled to grasp them. I saw planets that defied the laws of physics, where time moved differently and space folded upon itself in impossible ways. I saw beings, intelligent, ancient, and incomprehensible, whose forms twisted and writhed in shapes that made my skin crawl. They spoke to me in the same cryptic symbols, their messages filled with truths too vast for my mind to fully comprehend. The more I communicated with the entity, the more I felt my grip on reality slipping. At first, it was subtle, a strange sense of dizziness, a fleeting image that didn't quite belong in my vision. But as the days passed, the symptoms grew worse. I began to hear voices, faint whispers that seemed to come from the very stars themselves. I would see flashes of alien landscapes, blurring the line between what was real and what was imagined. My mind, once sharp and clear, felt like it was unraveling, each contact with the entity pulling me further into the unknown. The worst part came when I started to realize the truth. The beings I was contacting were not from another planet, not from another solar system. They were something far older, far more terrifying. They came from dimensions beyond human comprehension, realms that existed outside of time and space as we understood them. They were not bound by the laws of the universe. They were the laws of the universe. They existed between worlds, in places where time had no meaning, where reality itself bent and twisted like smoke in the wind. The more I learned, the more my mind fractured. I could no longer tell where the stars ended and where I began. I could no longer separate the alien worlds from the world I lived in. The boundaries between them blurred until I could feel the alien presence pressing against my skin, watching me, waiting for me to fall into their grasp. I tried to stop, to break free from the board and the entity that had taken hold of me. But it was too late. The stars had already marked me, and I had already seen too much. I could feel them, those ancient, incomprehensible beings, pulling me toward them, drawing me into the darkness between the stars. In the end, I became a part of their language, a part of the vast, endless void that stretches beyond the reach of human understanding. The stars no longer seemed distant. They were right here with me, watching, waiting. And I knew that I had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The night sky no longer held any mystery for me. It was no longer a place of wonder, but a dark, terrifying reality that I could not escape. The language of the stars had spoken to me, and now I was one of them. Story number 8. The Hidden Code. My obsession with languages began in my youth. As a linguist, I was fascinated by the idea of lost languages. Languages that had vanished into the folds of history, never to be understood again. I spent years of my life studying ancient scripts, poring over texts in forgotten dialects, deciphering clues left behind by civilizations long dead. But despite all my knowledge, there was always a nagging sense that I had missed something. Something more profound, more hidden, lurking just beyond my grasp. It was during one of my research trips, deep in the archives of an obscure library, that I found it. A small, nondescript book, bound in weathered leather, hidden behind rows of ancient tomes. Inside, it contained nothing but fragmented symbols and cryptic phrases, fragments of a language that appeared to be a hodgepodge of old scripts, none of which seemed to make sense. At first, I assumed it was a curious puzzle or a hoax, but as I studied it more, I began to sense something strange. The symbols on the pages weren't just random, they followed a pattern, a logic that seemed to defy the rules of any language I had ever encountered. I couldn't make sense of it at first, but I couldn't stop looking. It felt as if I were on the cusp of understanding something far greater than anything I had ever studied. It felt as if the language was speaking to me. That's when I decided to take a more direct approach. I had heard rumors, of course, rumors of people who had used Ouija boards to communicate with spirits, to reach beyond the veil of the living. I had always dismissed such things as superstition, but now, in my desperation to understand the language, I felt a strange pull toward it. Perhaps the spirits could help. Perhaps they could reveal the secrets of the language that had eluded me. I set up the Ouija board in my study, surrounded by the dusty relics of my research. As the night deepened, I placed my fingers lightly on the planchette and whispered the words, "If anyone is here, please speak to me. I seek knowledge." At first, the planchette moved slowly, almost lazily, spelling out a few benign answers. The messages seemed harmless enough, familiar even. They were in languages I recognized, fragments of ancient dialects. Some I had studied before. The spirits, if that's what they were, seemed willing to communicate in these familiar tongues. But then, something changed. The planchette moved faster, almost urgently, and the letters it spelled out became more erratic, more foreign. The symbols no longer resembled any known language. They were angular, strange, and incomprehensible. I was staring at a language I had never seen before, one that no human had ever encountered. It felt like a key, unlocking something ancient and forbidden. My heart raced as I tried to focus, to understand the meaning behind the words. But it was no use. The symbols twisted and shifted before my eyes, defying all logic and reason. I pressed on, desperate to decipher the code. Each time I asked the spirit to reveal more, the board responded with new symbols, more intricate and alien. The language seemed to evolve, becoming more complex, and as I pieced the symbols together, a pattern began to emerge. It was a description, one of a long-forgotten race of beings who had once roamed the earth, beings that existed far before humanity ever came into being. They were not physical beings, but entities that existed beyond our comprehension, tied to the very forces of entropy and decay. They were older than time itself, and they existed in the spaces between moments, beyond the reach of the physical world. The more I decoded, the more I learned about these beings that existed in the dark folds of reality, in the spaces where time and space no longer held meaning. They were not gods or spirits in the traditional sense. They were something far worse, far older, forces of destruction, tied to the end of all things. Their language was a tool, a method of communication between their kind and the mortal world. But it was not a language that could be understood by the human mind. No, this language was designed to break the mind, to unravel it, to prepare it for their return. As I continued to decipher the symbols, I began to feel something shift inside me. It was subtle at first, a faint sense of unease, a sensation that something was watching me. But then it grew. I could feel the language seeping into my thoughts, twisting my perceptions. It wasn't just that I was understanding the words were understanding me. They were taking root inside my mind, reshaping my thoughts, my very essence. I tried to stop. I tried to break away from the board, to rid myself of the presence that had attached itself to me. But it was too late. The language had already taken hold. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, a cold, unrelenting presence that was slowly changing me. My hands shook as I reached for the board again, compelled to continue, to learn more. The being, the entity, was growing stronger, and I could feel it, just beneath the surface of my consciousness. As I decoded the final symbols, the last phrase came through, one that filled me with a deep, primal terror. You are the vessel. In that moment, I understood. The beings I had been contacting were not just ancient spirits. They were not dead. They were alive, waiting for the moment when they could return to the physical world. And I had opened the door for them. I had become the conduit, the vessel they needed to manifest once more. My body is no longer my own. The language, the code, it is inside me now. It speaks through me, and I am no longer just a linguist. I am the doorway, and soon the beings will emerge, and with them, the end of all things. I can feel them gathering, their cold presence suffocating me from the inside. And the worst part is, I know I cannot stop them. They are here, and I have already begun to serve. Story number 9. The Endless Night. It was supposed to be a fresh start for our family. We had grown tired of city life, the noise, the constant rush. When we found the old mansion, tucked away in a remote part of the countryside, it seemed perfect. It was large, grand even, and had been abandoned for decades. It wasn't the kind of house you found every day, the kind of house with history, with character. The kind of house that promised something more than the ordinary. We moved in quickly, eager to leave the past behind. But there was always something strange about the mansion. At first, it was just the creaking of the old floors, or the way the windows seemed to groan when the wind blew. We told ourselves it was just the house settling, nothing more. But then, we found the Ouija board. It was hidden in the attic, buried beneath a pile of old blankets and boxes. The board was ancient, its edges worn, its surface covered in dust. But something about it called to us. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the idea of having a little fun. But one evening, after dinner, we decided to try it out. At first, the board seemed harmless. It answered our questions with simple, mundane responses. "Is there anyone here?" I asked, half laughing, expecting nothing. The planchette moved slowly to spell out YES. We laughed. It was just a game after all. "Who's there?" my daughter Sarah asked. The board answered. It was harmless, we thought. "I am." We continued asking more questions, each one trivial, each answer mundane. The board seemed to have a playful spirit, nothing sinister at all. But then, as we grew more confident, the answers began to change. They started becoming more cryptic, more strange. The planchette would pause for long moments, as if it were waiting to respond, before spelling out cryptic words. One night, the atmosphere felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened around us. We had been using the board for hours, laughing less now, our voices quieter. I asked, "What do you want?" The planchette moved with an unsettling swiftness, spelling out, "The endless night." I frowned. I hadn't expected that. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The board responded again, the words coming with an eerie slowness. "When the stars align, darkness will fall." I tried to shake off the growing unease in my chest. "Is this a joke?" I asked, but the planchette didn't move. The room seemed colder, the shadows darker. I turned to look at my family, but their faces were pale, their eyes wide with confusion. Then the board spelled out something that sent a cold chill down my spine. "You cannot leave." The air seemed to grow thicker still, suffocating, and for the first time I felt truly afraid. I moved to stand up, intending to end the game, but something stopped me, something I couldn't explain. The planchette moved again, but this time it spelled a name that wasn't familiar to any of us. "Ygath Thok," it read. I couldn't help it. A shiver ran through me. I had never heard that name before, but something in my gut told me it wasn't just a random collection of letters. It felt ancient, and it felt wrong. I looked at my family again, and I saw that they, too, were afraid now. But it wasn't just fear I saw in their eyes. It was something else, something far more unsettling. It was as if they had seen something, felt something that I hadn't. The room seemed to pulse, as though the house itself were breathing. I tried to speak, to tell them we needed to leave, but the words wouldn't come. I felt a pressure building in my chest, as though the house itself were pushing against me, closing in. I looked at the Ouija board again, but the words that now appeared were like nothing I had ever seen. The symbols were shifting, bending in ways that defied logic, as if they were moving between the spaces of time and reality. The board spelled out, "The night is upon you. You cannot escape." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room grew darker, colder. A heavy weight seemed to press down on us, crushing us under its unseen force. And then, something impossible happened. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, bending unnaturally, twisting like they were alive. I could feel something in the air, something ancient, something malevolent, filling the room. The mansion groaned, the walls vibrating as though the house itself were alive. Time seemed to slow. The very fabric of reality began to warp. The shadows deepened, the air thickened, and the house became more oppressive. I looked out the window, but the stars had vanished. The night sky was gone, replaced by an empty, dark void. And that was when I realized it. The entity, the one that had been speaking to us, wasn't just a spirit or a ghost. It wasn't from this world. It had been trapped in the mansion, buried beneath time for centuries. And now it was free. The board had opened a doorway. We had let it in. I turned to my family, but they were no longer the same. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted with something I couldn't understand. They were staring at the shadows, at the growing darkness. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at something else, something that was not from this world. I tried to move toward the door, to leave, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I could feel the mansion pulling me in, pulling us all deeper into its grip. The walls seemed to close in on us, and I realized with a sickening certainty that we were trapped. The entity spoke once more, its voice not from the board, but from everywhere, around us, within us, through us. The endless night has begun. The stars had aligned, the world was plunging into eternal darkness, and we were its prisoners, bound to the mansion, bound to the night that would never end. There was no escape. The night would consume us, and the mansion would keep us forever. The stars had vanished, and we would never see the light again. Story number 10. The Edge of Reality. I had always wondered about my mother. She had died when I was just a child, taken from me far too soon. I had only vague memories of her soft voice, her smile, the warmth of her presence. But those memories had faded over the years, leaving only a hollow ache in my chest. I had grown up without her, raised by my father and the distant relatives who did their best to fill the void, but no one could replace her. No one could fill the emptiness left by her absence. As I grew older, I began to yearn for a way to reconnect with her, to hear her voice again, even if just for a moment. That longing, that need to bridge the gap between life and death, led me to the Ouija board. It seemed like such a simple thing, just a game, a way to connect with the past. At least that's how I convinced myself. I had heard stories about people using it to contact spirits, to speak with loved ones who had passed on. I had no reason to believe it would work, but I thought, what could it hurt? Maybe, just maybe, I could reach my mother. One evening, I set up the board in the quiet of my room. The only sound in the house was the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. I had lit a candle, and the soft flicker of its flame cast long shadows across the walls. I placed my fingers lightly on the planchette, closed my eyes, and whispered, "Mom, if you can hear me, please talk to me." At first, nothing happened. The planchette remained still, unmoving, as if the board were just a lifeless object, as I had always thought it would be. But then, with a soft, almost imperceptible shift, it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it spelled out a word. "Hello." My heart skipped a beat. I felt a surge of emotion, relief, joy, disbelief, all at once. It was her. It had to be her. I could feel it in my bones. "Mom?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette moved again, spelling out Y-E-S. The messages continued in the same comforting, familiar manner. The answers were simple at first. Questions about my childhood, my life, about the things only a mother could know. It felt like the warm embrace of a memory long lost, a chance to relive the moments I had been denied. She spoke of love, of safety, of protection. It was everything I had hoped for, everything I had missed. For a brief moment, I forgot the pain of losing her, and I was at peace. But then, the tone of the messages began to change. The answers grew colder, more cryptic. I asked, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" And the planchette moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were struggling to convey something important. It spelled out, "Watching." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean, watching?" I asked. The board responded, "Always." A chill ran down my spine. I could feel the atmosphere in the room shift, as though something had entered, something that wasn't my mother. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward me, reaching out like tendrils. I pressed for more answers. "Who is watching me?" The planchette moved again, spelling out words that didn't make sense at first. My heart began to race. "Not your mother." "What do you mean?" I whispered. "Who are you?" The board hesitated, as though the entity on the other side was deciding whether to reveal itself. Finally, it spelled out, "I am the one who has been watching." My blood ran cold. The voice that had once been so familiar so comforting, was now alien, distant, and full of something I could not understand. The words that followed were chilling. "You have been a pawn." A deep sense of dread filled my chest, and I could feel the edges of my reality begin to fray. "What do you mean, a pawn?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The planchette moved swiftly, as if the entity had been waiting for me to ask. "I am not your mother. I am not of this world. I have been guiding you, shaping you, for as long as you have lived." I wanted to pull my hands away, to end the session, to escape whatever presence had taken hold of the board, but I could not move. The words continued to spill out, each one more terrifying than the last. "The veil between worlds is thin. I have been waiting. And now, you are mine." I felt a sharp, painful pressure in my chest, as though something was pushing against my heart. The room seemed to warp, the walls stretching and bending in unnatural ways. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend what was happening. The entity on the board had never been my mother. It had been watching me my entire life, manipulating me from the shadows, guiding me towards some unknown purpose. I tried to stand, to flee, but my body refused to obey. My vision blurred, the room spinning as I felt myself being pulled into something deeper, something far beyond my understanding. I was no longer just speaking to a spirit, no longer communicating with my mother. I was speaking to something ancient, something powerful, something that existed between worlds, far beyond the limits of human comprehension. The words that the planchette spelled out next sealed my fate. "The game has just begun." I could feel it then. The weight of its presence closing in around me, bending reality itself, pulling me toward an unknowable truth. I was not merely a vessel for a lost soul, but a tool in a cosmic game played by entities that existed beyond the boundaries of time and space. And as the darkness consumed me, I realized I was no longer in control. I was just a piece in a game far larger than I could ever comprehend. A pawn in the hands of forces that would never let me go.